Welcome to British Focus. If you care about the truth behind politics, you're in the right place. Before we dive in, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more updates on the latest political scandals. Labour promised no tax hikes or benefit cuts before the election. Yet now, millions of British citizens are feeling the consequences of their policies. And now, SNP's Seamus Logan has exposed Labour, claiming this isn't the real Labour government. Let's get into it.
Adequate government support for pensioners is vital to ensuring dignity in old age. Indeed, it's the mark of a civilised society, the extent to which it looks after vulnerable people. And remember, many pensioners only have the state pension as their main source of income. The recent actions to cut support for pensioners by the UK government has rightfully been met with anger. Labour MPs, including all Scottish Labour MPs, voted to cut the winter fuel payment for 900,000 Scots. Weeks later, Scottish Labour MSPs voted against an SNP government motion demanding the UK government reverse the introduction of means testing of the winter fuel payment. Now, Anna Sauer claims they're going to deliver it if he's elected next year. Pensioners don't have time for this kind of Scottish Labour false promises while their benefits are being cut. Now, while government ministers point to the uptake in pension credit as some sort of mitigation for cutting the winter fuel payment, it seems ridiculous that this cut was not delayed to allow for a longer uptake campaign. And I do hope the minister will tell us, because I don't understand yet what the trade-off is between the revenue that's been raised by the cut in the winter fuel payment and the uptake of pension credit. I'd like to hear if its uptake increases to, say, for example, 50 or 60%, what does that do to the money you're supposed to be raising as a result of this cut? If you had delayed it, it would have ensured that pensioners would not have missed out and reduced the number of pensioners going cold during this winter. And I come from one of the coldest parts of these islands. You probably have all heard of Braemar. It's often quoted as one of the coldest parts of the UK. It's in the northeast. It's close to Balmoral, the King's private estate. And I can tell you that many pensioners in the northeast are feeling the effects of this cold winter. And I totally endorse the comments that were made about the impact that this has on people's health, the increased admission rate to hospital, the increased number of delayed discharges as a result, and frankly, the increased number of avoidable deaths that are occurring as a result of these policies. In the general election campaign, Labour were elected on a platform of change, and I and many voters had no idea that this change was cutting the winter fuel payment for pensioners. See, I'm old enough to remember previous Labour governments, and I don't recognise this government as a real Labour government. It just doesn't seem like the kind of government that I was expecting. Earlier today, I see at least one colleague was with me in this chamber when we had a debate on fuel poverty in England. And we heard about all sorts of measures that the government could be taking. Social tariffs, for example, social prescribing, perhaps more importantly, some sort of windfall tax on the obscene profits that energy companies are making, somewhere in the region of, I think the figure quoted was 423 billion or something of that order. A windfall tax on that, and that level of profit, would make any saving that you made as a result of the winter fuel payment absolutely dwarfed by comparison. And as already referred to, another failure of pensioner support from the UK government, both Labour and Conservative, I might add, was on WASPI compensation. I was shocked to see the Secretary of State for the Department for Work and Pensions happily pose for a photograph with WASPI women while in opposition, but ignore them and the Ombudsman report that demanded compensation as soon as he came to power. But it's not just that policy, it's other policy positions as well that are hurting pensioners. For example, the employer's national insurance contribution charges. That's leading to reduced third sector service provision. The farmer's family tax, that's leading to higher prices at the supermarket. And this is hitting the most vulnerable people in society, and those are those pensioners that I've referred to. I'll wind up now, Madam Chairman. just simply to say that, as I said earlier, to me, all of this shows that this government fundamentally does not understand the situation of so many pensioners across the UK.
Keir Starmer's Labour government is proving to be one of the most disappointing and deceptive administrations in recent British history. The promises of fairness, stability, and protection for the most vulnerable have turned into an outright betrayal of the British people. Pensioners, workers, and taxpayers alike are witnessing the collapse of yet another so-called progressive government that was meant to bring real change. Instead, what we see is a Labour Party that bears little resemblance to the one that once stood for the working class. The real question is, was Starmer ever truly Labour? Or was his entire campaign built on deception, manipulation, and the appeasement of corporate elites? The Great Betrayal, Labour's false promises. Many of you might remember how Starmer and his MPs vowed not to raise taxes and not to cut benefits before the election. These promises were repeated time and time again, cementing Labour's image as the party that would prioritise the needs of the people over austerity and corporate interests. But what happened once they took power? Tax hikes, benefit cuts, broken promises, lies. The decision to cut the winter fuel payment for nearly 1 million Scots is a disgrace. This isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. This is about real people, the elderly, the vulnerable, those who depend on these payments to survive. The cost of living crisis has left many pensioners struggling to heat their homes. And what does Labour do? They turn their backs on them. Scottish Labour MPs, who should have been standing up for their constituents, were complicit in this betrayal. First, they voted to cut the winter fuel payment. Then, weeks later, when the SNP put forward a motion demanding the UK government reverse this cruel policy, Scottish Labour MSPs voted against it. This is not just incompetence, this is calculated deceit. Labour ministers now claim that pension credit uptake will somehow make up for the loss of the winter fuel payment. Does Starmer honestly expect people to believe this? The process to claim pension credit is bureaucratic and complicated, and many pensioners are unaware they even qualify. The government should have launched an extensive campaign to increase awareness and accessibility before cutting vital support. But they didn't. They rushed through a decision that will leave thousands of elderly citizens suffering through one of the coldest winters in years. Staring into the abyss, Starmer's Labour is not Labour at all. Labour's traditional base, the working class, pensioners, and everyday citizens, has been abandoned. The government is now more interested in pandering to the elites, pushing neoliberal policies, and pretending to be fiscally responsible at the expense of ordinary people. Does this sound familiar? Because it should. We've seen it before with Tony Blair's New Labour, and now we're seeing it again. Labour under Starmer is nothing more than a watered-down, corporate-controlled, centre-right party masquerading as the voice of the people. But let's be clear, Keir Starmer was never a true Labour leader. He campaigned on progressive policies, only to abandon them the moment he got into power. He promised to uphold workers' rights, but we've seen little action. He claimed he would protect public services, yet he continues to undermine them. This is not leadership. This is not Labour. This is political fraud. Failing the most vulnerable. Starmer's cold-hearted policies. The winter fuel crisis is only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Labour's failures under Starmer. Let's talk about tax increases on hard-working Britons. Labour, the so-called party of the working class, has implemented policies that hit low and middle-income earners the hardest. Where are the tax increases on major corporations? Where are the measures to curb excessive executive pay? Nowhere. Instead, Starmer's government is relying on regressive taxation, squeezing more money out of struggling families while letting the rich off the hook. And all of this while public services remain underfunded and in crisis. Starved public services. Where's the money going? The NHS is collapsing under the weight of underfunding, mismanagement, and a lack of real reform. Starmer, despite all his big promises, has done nothing to reverse the damage inflicted by years of conservative neglect. Waiting times are increasing. Hospitals are overcrowded. Nurses and doctors are overworked and underpaid. Ambulance response times are at record lows. Where is Starmer's plan? Where is his bold vision for fixing this crisis? Nowhere to be found. Instead of taking real action, he's pushing weak half measures while prioritizing corporate-friendly policies. It's clear that the Labour government is failing the very people it was elected to protect. Energy giants win, the people lose. And let's talk about the biggest hypocrisy of all, the energy crisis. Starmer and his ministers had an opportunity to introduce a windfall tax on energy companies making obscene profits off the backs of struggling citizens. The numbers don't lie. These corporations are raking in hundreds of billions while ordinary people are forced to choose between heating and eating. Yet Labour's approach has been weak at best. Where is the bold action? Where is the real leadership? Nowhere. Instead, Starmer is more interested in keeping corporate donors happy than actually helping the people who put him in office. The political cowardice of Keir Starmer. Starmer's leadership has been marked by weakness, hypocrisy, and betrayal. He lacks conviction, he lacks vision, and most importantly, he lacks the courage to stand up for the people who need him most. Unlike past Labour leaders who fought for real change, Starmer plays it safe, afraid to challenge the establishment, afraid to make real enemies, and afraid to take a stand on anything that might upset his powerful allies. He is a career politician, not a leader. He doesn't have a plan. He doesn't have a vision. He only has empty words and broken promises. Is this the worst Labour government in history? Many voters who once believed in Labour's message of hope and progress are now questioning whether this is the worst Labour government in modern history. The working class is worse off. Pensioners are suffering. Public services are collapsing. And yet, Starmer acts as if everything is fine. Labour was supposed to bring change, but instead, they've brought betrayal, incompetence, and a complete disregard for the very people they were elected to serve. So, I ask you, do you recognise this as a Labour government? Or has Starmer completely abandoned the principles of the party? Let us know in the comments below.